What if your therapist is using the same tactics as a narcissistic parent and calling it treatment? What if therapy is teaching you to keep your hands on a burning hot plate and alter your reaction to the fact that you're burning? Today, we're exposing how therapy can function as compliance training, and I'm giving you a diagnostic tool, the ability to recognise when you're being pushed to comply instead of being listened to. Now, by the end, you'll be able to spot the phrases that gaslight you, identify the tactics that cast you as the scapegoat, and see the class filter that determines who gets to heal and who gets told they're still failing. So, if you've ever left a therapy session feeling like you're the problem for noticing the problem, you weren't imagining that. Here's one quick story to show how therapy language gaslights you into doubting yourself so you're easier to manipulate. Here we go. You're sitting across from your therapist. Now, you've just explained the Trevor situation at work. A sneering blonde dude who undermines you in meetings, twists your words to others and makes subtle digs that you can't quite prove. Like, of course someone like you would think like that. Now, there are odd silences when you enter a room and suppressed laughter, and you sense Trevor is convincing people that you're incompetent, but you can't really concretise it fully because it just feels slippery. Your therapist is nodding now, sympathetic, professional. I hear that you're feeling targeted, but let's explore your reaction to this situation. Are you assuming it was meant with ill intent when it wasn't? I mean, reading too much into things, or assuming that you can read others' thoughts? Now you're flummoxed. Your boss knows about this issue and recommended you come here herself via the employee assistant program. But does this mean she thinks you're the problem somehow? Are you reading too much into things? You're handed a worksheet. A list of possible ways your thoughts and feelings may not be accurate. You work through the list, debunking your own thoughts and intuitions. At the end of the session, you feel somehow worse, like ashamed, betrayed, alone. Is the therapist working on the assumption that you are imagining the whole thing? That idea hurts, but she's a professional, right? Weeks later, and your boss calls you in. Stern look, folded arms, saying that you can't get along with others and that your teammates' reviews of your work have dropped significantly. Yeah, in the months since Trevor arrived. But you don't want to look like you haven't learned anything. So you sit there, not trusting yourself enough to act. You end up leaving, clutching your official warning letter. This story is not made up. It's a story sent in by a listener, and really by many listeners in slightly different forms. Many of us, with our hands burning on a hot plate, have been told not to move our hands away at all, but to change how we feel about the fact that we are burning. From the mum with a manipulative partner who was told her reactions to his manipulation were the issue, to the arthritis patient whose pain management program encouraged him to reframe his pain, to the patient with a history of parental abuse who's told to forgive their abuser. Many of us, instead of being helped by therapy, have been gaslit into thinking our issues are not the real issue. So, if you've ever ended up in therapy that treated the symptom while protecting the world that caused it, you aren't alone, and you weren't imagining that, because the values we hold as a society end up making it that way. If this is your first time here, I'm Jordan Reyne, a philosophy graduate with a severe allergy to self-help gurus. And this is The Loneliness Industry, a podcast that discusses the many, many reasons that loneliness is not your fault. It's structural and enforced by the values, practices and institutions of our culture. One of those institutions is therapy. Today, our focus is how therapy works as compliance training, how it ensures that everything you do, how you eat, sleep, breathe, move, look, feel, can be framed as something you're doing wrong, keeping you in the loop of feeling like all of this is your fault. This week, Foucault, Lasch and Girard are going to help us understand how therapy can end up as a means to elicit compliance to the system, and how, in the wrong hands, it calls on the very tactics a narcissistic parent would. Now let me say this up front, this is not about attacking therapy professionals. This is about the institution that is therapy. The training systems, the treatment goals, the worldview, the process. Meaning, we are looking at the ideological and institutional structure that frames what therapy is allowed to become in certain hands. Today we're going to start by outlining where we are now. Then we dive into the philosophy of how we got there. And to achieve our first task, we will be creating a therapy speak travel guide. You know, there's phrase books for tourists where commonly used sentences are translated, except this one is not a destination unknown, it is a guide for the here and now. Also, it doesn't have sections like dining out or how not to accidentally order deep-fried rat's eyes in a restaurant. No, in this travel guide, the section titles are a giveaway about how crap this temporal location actually is. Instead of leisure time and going shopping, our therapy talk phrases fall into these categories: invalidating your reality, manufacturing compliance, weaponized boundaries, and marking the scapegoat. Because who won't be visiting an Orwellian nightmare destination sometime soon? So, section 1, we're going to start with the therapy talk phrases that fall into the category of invalidating your reality. So, who among you has heard this one? You're making assumptions. Or, those may be cognitive distortions. Or, the more passive-aggressive version of this, could your thinking be wrong here? Spoiler, you have to say yes, because these phrases are designed to coerce you into agreeing with one fundamental premise: that your thinking is wrong, and that is the root of all of your woes. Now, of course, this assumes a right way to think, and that you are not familiar with it. You have to be shown the right way to think by an authority. Here's another coercion into accepting your own madness. I know some of you have heard this one, and I have too. Look, you have a trauma history. You can't trust your own nervous system. This one is such an insidious sleight of hand that I'm going to say more about it in a sec. But first, note that the aim of all of the phrases thus far is twofold. 1, to make you discount or distrust yourself. 2, to create a power vacuum. Because when you are deemed unreliable, someone else gets to step in and tell you where the truth lies. The exact comment about not trusting your nervous system if you have a trauma history came up in our online group the other day too. Like, having CPTSD, I've heard it myself a lot as well. So a quick aside to explain the sleight of hand here. The nervous system has subtypes, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, research shows that when we are in sympathetic nervous system arousal, that is fight, flight, freeze or fawn, those things become the priority. So self-protection becomes a priority, not reproduction, not digestion, not even tissue repair, and certainly not slow, considered thinking. Now, in those states, we are essentially in panicked act now mode. And that is the case for everyone when they're in sympathetic nervous system activation. The same research shows that when we are not in that state, digestion, reproduction, all those other things come back online, and things like your gut and intuition are in working order. So this is the non-panicked reactions that you can trust. This is also the case for everyone. So the only difference for those of us with CPTSD or other trauma-related conditions is this. We go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode potentially more often or potentially in response to quite different things. But this does not mean we should distrust our entire damn nervous system, which consists of both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And our sympathetic is triggered for some good reasons sometimes. So, if the reason we should distrust our whole nervous system is because of how our sympathetic nervous system operates, then no one should trust their nervous system, regardless of their background. We all have a sympathetic nervous system that will turn on at some point. So this phrase ends up being very similar to others, like, this is your trauma talking, or even you're catastrophizing. All are used to directly discredit your assessments and thoughts, as if they're always and only operating from some panicked act now state. And aside from the clear power imbalance all this creates, which Foucault is going to help us understand the roots of, this tactic might well be familiar for a lot of you. Constantly invalidating someone's reality, without considering whether their assessment is actually fair and sound, is more commonly known as gaslighting. Now we get to the parallel I've been on about since episode 8, And that was the episode on covert narcissistic tactics, where we showed that society often operates like a covert narcissistic parent. Invalidating someone's reality, aka gaslighting, is a favourite tactic of toxic and manipulative people, exactly because it creates a power dynamic and dependency. If I can convince you not to rely on your judgments and gut feelings, you are a rudderless, self-doubting ship who will come to me for truths. Now cults use this tactic, and self-styled gurus too, yet somehow dressing it all up in psych speak means nobody notices. And really, I could have called this section the Gaslighter's Handbook, because our travel guide is off to a sinister start. As with most dystopian texts, though, this is intended as a warning, and not as a handbook on how to fuck up other people's lives. Foucault is going to show us why the emergence of these tactics is no accident very soon. In the meantime, the next set of phrases may also be familiar. Cluster 2, manufacturing compliance. Or let's just call this obedience training, because this is about getting you to behave in ways that society and your therapist approve of. So, hands up if you've ever heard the following. You must learn to challenge your automatic thoughts. And whilst this can be fair when such thoughts are intrusive or just sort of a mini version of your freak show of a parent, when used in a non-nuanced general way, it translates to this. Your gut reaction is wrong. You require expert correction. Here's another one that I find personally utterly infuriating. You know when you say something like, it seems like my sadness is linked to the structural impossibility of reciprocal recognition within an atomized neoliberal subject formation, which renders intimacy functionally non-viable unless one is a golden retriever or a sex worker. And you're hit with this. That's intellectualizing. Yes it is. I'm a fucking philosopher. What do you want me to do? Grunt? We've already been told not to trust our thoughts, gut feelings or perceptions. And now we're being instructed to stop using our brains altogether. Our thinking is labelled a defence mechanism rather than a potentially valid insight. So a heads up, I will continue to intellectualise until the end of this video, pausing only briefly to insert the words fuck compliance training. Here's another famous phrase that you may well have heard. You need to work on frustration tolerance, or resilience, or whatever other buzzword is now code for suck up the unfair treatment. The translation is this: do not show emotion when faced with structural barriers or unfairness. Sucking it up is the new cool. How about this one? Think more positively. Now, not just for therapy, obviously, but for self-help and crystal-eating spiritualists as well. The translation here is, please delude yourself into becoming a smiling gimp so that you don't wander around upsetting everyone else who digs capitalism. Related to that is, let's focus on what you can control. Meaning, forget structural violence, exploitative labour conditions, or your basic human need to just scream into the void now and then. Those aren't the issue. Your reaction to them is. This is also where all the red herrings get invoked. You can change how you sleep, breathe, move, think, eat, look, and so on. So let's distract ourselves with those so that the system around us remains uninterrogated. Interruption. Quick pause, because this is actually part of the project too. What I'm doing here, which is building a full philosophical theory of loneliness, power, and the mental health industry, it doesn't get brands or sponsors. It only exists if people like you decide it should. Right now, this is the very beginning, and there are about 25 paying members, which almost covers the basic running costs. But to turn this into a proper ongoing research project, something we can keep building for years instead of months, I need around 150 people who decide, yes, I want this to exist in the world. If you join now, you're not just another subscriber. You're one of the people who can legitimately say, I was there at the start. This only kept going because I helped build it. So membership starts at $5 a month, and you get extra videos just for supporters, and you get to be part of the Discord discussion group where we support each other and generate ideas. But mostly, you become the infrastructure that lets this work keep naming what's actually happening to us all. And about these little interruptions, if and when this becomes sustainable, they'll mostly disappear, because I'll be able to just make the work and not constantly explain how it's funded. So if you'd like more philosophy and fewer breaks like this, becoming a member is one of the ways to nudge things in that direction. This won't keep happening without you. So please hit the join here on YouTube or head to thelonelinessindustry.net if you want to be part of the founding members who make all of this possible. Now, on with the podcast. Another really quite insidious one. Keep a thought record. Now, I think Foucault would have projectile vomited across the therapy room at this one. It's journaling as an act of self-surveillance, like Panopticon Light, now available in pastel notebook form. And where I live, the Stasi used to do that for you. But why leave it to your neighbour to report every rule you broke when you can now internalise the snitch and do it yourself? Learning to blame ourselves more efficiently is now the done thing. A self-administered loyalty oath to the system. So, cluster 3. Weaponized boundaries. It's on to the kind of phrases that, with practice and a few rolls of duct tape, can be used to create your own dystopia at home or in the workplace. Here, our phrases invoke a world where Joe Shithead can run around punching you and everyone else in the face and count on your forgiveness, because you will be told that being pissed at him is your responsibility to manage. Yep, this is where phrases like, only you are responsible for your feelings, and you can only heal if you learn to forgive, translate into your suffering being ignored and you being punished for calling out other people's shit behaviour. Now, a friend of mine was once told that she would not be able to heal until she learned to forgive her uncle, who had abused her as a child. Now, she had a child of her own, and she said something that I have never forgotten. Look, if someone did the same thing as my uncle did to me, to my own child, do you think I'd be dragging her along to him to say, oh, forgive your uncle, dear? No, I would not. That would be monstrous and invalidating for her. And as for him, he'd learned nothing. So why are you asking me to do this with my own inner child when it would be equally invalidating? And of course, she went on to add that we send people to jail for that stuff. We don't stand up in a line and forgive them as some sort of act of self-aggrandizing martyrdom. And when you put things like that to your therapist, you may hear something like this. I need to set boundaries to limit your critique of their authority. Or you might get this. You need to be open to the process, to pathologize any resistance you might have to going along with all of this. Now, if you are Joe Shithead or that criminal uncle, you're away laughing. I mean, the therapist is on your side without even knowing you, which does kind of point to who really benefits from all this. When I showed in episode 8 how society functions like a covert narcissistic parent, Joe Shithead was that societal parent, landing gut punches on all and sundry, with the victims learning to blame themselves, even though it clearly isn't their fault. And this leads very naturally into the next set of stock phrases for our travel guide. But if this resonates with you so far, please click the like button. It helps others who are going through this too to realise that they're not going mad. The system is. So click the like button, it'll be a big help. Finally, the X-rated edition that gets left out in general publications of such travel guides. The section that amounts to insults, character assassinations, and offensive shit to say about your mum. And because this is a handbook for professionals, it isn't called swearing in a foreign language. It is called how to marginalise someone whilst looking authoritative. Hands up if you've ever heard this. That's your, insert some diagnosis, talking. So that's your CPTSD talking. This is how your perspective is dismissed by a label bestowed on you by someone in power. How about this one? Now that might not be the case because people with your condition have trouble doing thing X correctly. Again, justifying the exclusion of your opinion, presence or additional needs via a stereotype. And last but not least, after dealing with Joe Shithead and calling him out as an asshole, we want to steer clear of the victim mentality. Do you notice the pattern? Each of these phrases takes your potentially legitimate response to a shitty situation and turns it into being about your pathology. This isn't healing. It is a power dynamic. It is what Foucault termed normalization, which we're going to get to in a minute, and it's been operating for centuries. So our travel guide so far shows us this. 1. How invalidation phrases and scapegoat labelling function as coercion mechanisms. They establish a power imbalance, operate to extract vulnerability and an admittance of fault, then weaponize them. Number 2. How compliance manufacturing phrases and weaponized boundaries establish self-surveillance to make compliance self-sustaining. Now, our travel guide brings some important cultural values to light about this destination, as any good travel guide should. The institution, that is therapy, has 3 central concepts that drive it: power, exclusion, and a set of tactics that operate like a covert narcissistic parent would. But before we bring in Lasch, Foucault and Girard to explain these 3 elements, you are likely wondering, how the fuck did therapy become this? So some history for you. Back in the 80s and 90s, while Madonna was inventing nipple tassels and grunge was making it very clear just how depressed everyone was, despite such innovations, there was a shift going on in psychology. This was in alignment with the rising neoliberal preferences for cost-effective, individualized, productivity-oriented therapy, and a shift from psychoanalysis towards CBT was underway. Now, psychoanalysis was all about the inner world, understanding one's values, fears, desires, and deepest yearnings. It had a nice power dynamic going on, but it took years and did not necessarily improve what was termed workplace compliance. So, born out of behaviouralism, CBT focused on the outside and how one behaved. The proof of whether one was healed or not was measured by how they acted. So the outcomes and the means of measuring them were far more in line with what capitalism desired: quantifiable results, lower cost, and, more crucially, quick returns. People were back at work, behaving the way that you needed them to, in weeks or months, instead of years. Now, they may or may not have felt better, but that was not the pressing concern. This is capitalism, remember. The concern is productivity, emotional regulation, and competition. The inner world? Under behaviouralism, if you act happy, then you must be happy. End of story. Healthcare, let's not forget, is an industry, even when it's government funded. So if you can get 80 people to act how you need them to act, quickly, for the same amount of money that it would take to get 30 people to not necessarily act how you need them to, no-brainer. But here's the issue. We actually know what healing requires. It has been studied extensively. It requires the following: safety, connection, structural support, validation of reality, and non-coercive meaning-making. Now, according to research by Ardito and Rabellino in 2011 and Duncan et al. In 2010 and more, this is the kind of environment that fosters meaningful change. It fosters friendships and deep relationships too. This is not, however, well aligned with capitalism's preferred setup, as Christopher Lasch makes clear in his work. Now, as many of you know already from this podcast, Lasch showed how Western culture has become increasingly narcissistic. So instead of these conditions for healing that we just outlined, he shows how our currently narcissistic society systematically destroys every precondition for psychological growth: safety, connection, structural support, reality validation, and shared meaning, and then blames the individual for failing to thrive in that setup. The crucial convergence here: what Lasch describes at the societal level is functionally identical to the tactics of a covert narcissistic parent. In a narcissistic family system, reality is denied, needs are framed as defects, emotions become evidence of disloyalty, and love is conditional on compliance. In these systems, individuals are not supported, they're managed, and narcissistic societies operate the same way, just scaled up. Self-doubt, gaslighting, and asymmetrical power, they're not bugs. They are the operating system. And therapy, as an institution, is designed to help us function within that system, whilst distracting us from that system itself, via concentrating on our breathing, for example. meaning therapy's purpose must align and fit in with the broader narcissistic operating system to get you to internalise the expectations of those in power, to make you police your own thoughts, to make you blame yourself for any pain, loneliness, or awful experience you might have. Self-blame, dressed up as healing or self-development, is a massive, booming market. Fixing how you eat, drink, walk, breathe, think, move, feel, and so on is an industrial-level distributor of red herrings, all designed to give you a distraction project, while real structural issues go unnoticed underneath the obligatory self-obsession. Because just like narcissistic parents, narcissistic cultures, including Western capitalism, cannot admit fault. They cannot be questioned, cannot be wrong, and certainly cannot be held responsible for the suffering they create. So like any narcissistic system does, it uses all the tactics it can muster to outsource the burden of being wrong. And this is not just metaphor. As Lindsay C. Gibson documents in Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, narcissistic family systems assign roles. The golden child and the scapegoat, for example, to ensure that blame never lands where it belongs. So René Girard, in part 2, observes this on a societal scale. Systems unable to tolerate their own flaws must assign blame elsewhere. Someone has to carry the fault the system refuses to hold. He calls this the scapegoat function, and we're going to dig into that later, but for now we'll stay with the psychological mechanisms. In narcissistic systems, roles are assigned. These are designed to keep those in power immune from blame, and those not in power distracted with various tasks. Now, many of you who've watched me before already know about the role of the scapegoat in narcissistic family systems, and the role of the golden child too. Capitalism uses these as well, and it does it via something you may never suspect: the hero narrative. The hero narrative makes me, the centre of my universe. It makes me, the most important character, with a purpose and a genius of some sort. And as long as I do great things by the societal narcissistic parent standards, I will get rewarded. Here's the interesting thing though. We all got sold that. We all get sold the option to be the golden child. But in this utterly atomized culture, we get two roles for the price of one. We get to be the scapegoat if we fail to be the hero. The system, in other words, installs both roles inside you, inside all of us. You become your own, or the public's, golden child when you succeed within the system, and you become your own, or the public's, scapegoat when you fail. And just like in a narcissistic family, even the performing, winning hero is not immune. There is always the possibility that power and its institutions can flip the switch to scapegoat for us at any given moment, especially if your skin colour or gender is the one they've just matched to the new find build. The hero-scapegoat mechanism works as follows. For the system to stay exempt from admitting its own flaws, it must convince you that you are powerful enough to be responsible for everything that happens. That's why control over everything is such a big deal in capitalism. And this is where the hero narrative's promise is ingenious. Western culture doesn't just tell you to be responsible. It tells you you are the only real character, the sole architect of your destiny, the person who can manifest outcomes through hustle, mindset, positivity, and grit. Everyone else becomes an NPC in the epic of you. Now, for a lot of people, understandably, that feels empowering and glorious, right? But it's a setup. You can go from golden hero to epic failure faster than a contestant getting voted off a reality show for using someone's hamster as an anal probe. Because if you're the hero of your story, the sole architect, the main character with unlimited agency, then when things go wrong, there's only one person who could have been responsible for it. You. Even when it wasn't actually your idea with the hamster. The same narrative that made you omnipotent now makes you omniculpable. Once you are cast as omnipotent, any failure, and failure is inevitable, is transformed from being something that happens into something that you are. Because really, once anyone does that with a hamster, it's really all anyone talks about. Anyway, that shift from event to identity is very important in how narcissistic systems rule. That shift from event to identity is the psychological essence of shame. In grandiose hero mode, we're meant to think, I can do anything. Now, when we fuck up, which is unavoidable, we're meant to think, I am so flawed, I suck to the core as a person, I need help. Now, the latter is where you get to bear the shame and blame that might never have been yours. And that shame is not the cause of narcissism either. It is the wreckage created when the narcissistic fantasy you've been sold collides with reality. It is what remains when superhuman expectations fail, and the narcissistic culture, your societal parent, calls that failure you, and sends you to its corrective infrastructure, i.e. therapy. Now, of course, a lot of you didn't buy that myth at all. Many of you did notice that the world is unfair and that other people aren't NPCs and are sentient with feelings and aspirations of their own, or you realise that you have limitations like every other human being, or that, you know, those who really go for the whole hero thing can be complete assholes. But when that happens, though, and you see through it, you don't get told, well done, what a rational, relational human assessment. No, neither accurate intellectualising nor anything else will get you out of what happens when you see the hero role for the farce that it is. And what happens is this. The switch is flipped to scapegoat, to problem child. The system can't be blamed, remember, so you must be. Irrationality has little to do with this. It's about you not executing the script properly, you breaking the story, you ruining the great big smiley-faced show. Because the scapegoat is the flip side of the hero myth. The same narrative that crowns you the sovereign also makes you liable for every crack in the world. In this framework, you're not just a person, you are the god, either of your Instagram perfect destiny or of the fallout that occurs when you continue to act like just some human being. Now, as I mentioned, this is all intricately linked to our value of control, which I discuss in episode 3. If you can't control everything sufficiently to make a go of it, you're meant to feel shame. Your despair is not considered evidence of systemic failure. It's reinterpreted as proof of your personal defect. The institutions, industries and markets will ensure that is how things get interpreted, and therapy is one of those industries. Now let's get back to Lasch and a bit of psych, because adopting two mind-shatteringly incompatible and opposite roles depicts something else that should also be familiar. It is the boom-bust, grandiose, vulnerable cycle of narcissism. Inflate, collapse, repeat. And the system trains us into this by making the grandiose boom part our normal, by convincing us that anything less than omnipotence is failure. So your trauma, loneliness, exhaustion, exploitation, even your rage must become evidence that you have failed despite your supposed superpowers. The racist employer isn't the issue. Your reaction is. The violent partner isn't the problem. Your boundaries are. Other people's agency, responsibility, and moral fabric evaporate. Only yours remains. So the cult of me eventually flips into me to blame for everything. Self-aggrandizement collapses into self-blame and shame. And that is exactly what's meant to happen. Because shame is about you. Not your actions, you. Despair, anger, righteous rage, those point outwards. Those demand change, or at least others to reflect on why they bash people in the face. So therapy keeps you focused on yourself, on you and your shame, dressing it in clinical authority and healing language, and steering you away from blaming the system, and steering you away from where the blame belongs with the system, with all manner of red herrings. And now the key point. In a narcissistic society, responsibility flows downwards. Power flows upwards. the system remains immaculate and you become the problem. In our society, just like narcissistic families, the blame game is totalizing. Remember, nothing can't be framed as you're doing it wrong. Nothing. There is always an official right way, as decreed by an authority, that can be held up as evidence of your failure. So voila, flaws with our society, our narcissistic system, have been safely located elsewhere, in the scapegoat. Now Lasch showed us how the individual is primed for the self-blame that powers this. Foucault will show us how dissent, which today amounts to refusing the hero narrative, gets pathologized. And Girard, in part 2, gives us the missing piece. Why a system like ours cannot even function without scapegoats. But Foucault first, answering the crucial question of how the fuck did therapy become a mechanism for social control? Now, if you're a regular listener, you'll know Foucault for two things. The panopticon effect, and how societies construct madness based on whatever threatens its core values. So, let's go back to the days before therapy chairs, where confessionals did the job instead. We are in medieval Europe. It's the Renaissance, so 1400s to 1500s, and no one has invented proper plumbing or toilets yet, so it smells terrible. Everyone is painting saints and babies like there's no tomorrow to distract themselves from the stench. And some people are claiming they see angels. Their seeing angels is not considered mad. Rather, those seeing them are deemed to be touched by God. At that time, such visions were considered divine inspiration, and what we now call strange behaviour was sacred. But back then, such people wandered freely and were fed by communities and were part of social life. This was not just because everyone needed supernatural stories to distract themselves from inadequate toilet facilities. It was because the church held power at the time, and these people's behaviour supported and fit in with exactly the kind of power the church held. Religious, divine, non-quantifiable by science. So fast forward to the sewage systems and factory wheels of the 1800s. By now, rationality had taken over as a core value. Religion had been replaced by science, or at least by preference for reason. So the same behaviours, seeing angels and so on, was now seen as irrational. And irrationality was the worst thing you could be, because it was the opposite of the new core value, rationality. This is where all those people who had previously been institutionalized or exiled or killed for questioning the Bible saw much happier, less stinky days. They were now considered the sane ones because they were in line with rationality. Their behaviour hadn't changed either. The core value of society was what had changed, and with it, our definitions of what was mad or normal. This is one of Foucault's most crucial insights. Madness isn't an objective medical reality. It's a mechanism that serves to correct our behaviour and bring it in line with society's core values. In other words, the construction of madness is a form of social control. In Western cultures, psychiatric language evolved to pathologize those who deviate from what capitalism requires of them. We are required to be compliant, self-monitoring, productive workers who do not act in ways that disturb the status quo. In recalling our travel guide, this might be clearer now. Today's therapy speak supports this very aim. The mechanism is easy to spot too. In a culture where individualism is glorified and the whole I don't need anyone idea is associated. And the mechanism is easy to spot too. In a culture where individualism and extreme independence, not needing anyone, is glorified, we associate that with words like strong, independent, takes responsibility. The lone wolf is our hero, where anyone admitting that they long for connection is hit with words like needy, codependent, or anxiously attached, terms especially designed to make the opposite of our ideal, independence, look pathological. And let us not forget that those who write the DSM in a country that worships extroversion suggested that its opposite, introversion, be listed in said DSM, as if that was pathological too. And today, when you are depressed, because we are now so structurally atomized and so closed off from each other that we have no sense of belonging, you're not actually sick, but because you are throwing into question the social order that benefits from all those things, the language needs to shift to make you look sick. Labeling you sick means your opinion is written off. It means the system can continue as it was. Your anger at racism, sexism, and pending ecological disasters gets assigned new words like dysregulation. Your clarity and insights get relabeled as intellectualizing or cognitive distortion. Your resistance and protest become maladaptive coping strategies. This is Foucault's mechanism in action, redefining behaviours as madness as a form of social control. And before we look at exactly how this operates in practice, I have a question for you. Have a think about this. How sane does it seem to you to look around the world right now, or even to look at your own situation of isolation and struggle right now and say, this is great, I feel awesome. For me, depression is one of many potential examples of a so-called pathology, is the only sane reaction to a deeply fucked society. But back to those who are part of the approved institutions. We are now going to look at therapy's golden child, CBT. Here we turn to the most widely practiced, most insurance-approved therapy model in existence, cognitive behavioural therapy. CBT has become the gold standard of modern therapy. Insurance covers it, employers offer it, it's evidence-based, and really it is the gold standard in terms of what needs to be done. So let's look at what that actually is. Your hand is on a hot plate. You're burning. CBT doesn't ask whether the plate should be turned off. CBT assumes the plate is correct, and your perception of burning is the malfunction. Maybe you're catastrophizing. Is it really that hot? Let's examine the evidence. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the burning really? Have you considered that your thoughts about burning are creating unnecessary suffering? Here is where the mechanisms of covert narcissistic parenting are mirrored. You're taught not to trust your intuition. Maybe I'm being dramatic to think that I'm burning. You're taught to question your own perception of pain. Is this really unbearable, or am I just telling myself that it is? The aim becomes not to change your situation, but to buckle down and do what's expected of you. The aim is to keep the environment, the system, invisible, and to make you the source of blame. You're exhausted from working 3 jobs? CBT doesn't question why 3 jobs are necessary. It teaches you to reframe your thoughts about exhaustion. What's the evidence that you can't handle this? Let's change that belief. You're anxious about not affording rent? CBT doesn't address housing costs. It teaches you breathing exercises and cognitive restructuring. Your anxiety is irrational. Let's work on distress tolerance. You're angry about workplace exploitation? CBT doesn't validate that anger, it pathologizes it as cognitive distortion, all or nothing thinking, emotional reasoning. Let's develop more balanced thoughts. This is Foucault's nightmare made real. Psychiatric language that trains you to internalize oppression as a personal dysfunction, to gaslight yourself on behalf of the system, to become your own jailer. No wonder CBT is the gold standard. It does exactly what it's meant to do: correct our behaviour and blind us to a failing system, push us into self-questioning and self-monitoring with the promise that control can be ours. It's the panopticon effect that you've all come to know and hate, the soft power that covert narcissists and covert narcissistic societies both operate on. We internalize the rules of those in power voluntarily because we've been trained to believe that our own perspective is flawed and that theirs is correct. It is gold from capitalism's perspective. You don't need external control when people police their own thoughts. You don't need to fix exploitative conditions when workers fix their attitudes instead. And you don't need social change when individuals change their cognitions. And best of all, you don't even have to look like the bad guy. I mean, you're labeling this help so that no one suspects a damn thing. They aren't looking at the system anymore. They are too busy taking themselves apart. CBT is the institutionalized compliance training we've come to call therapy. It is the most widely practiced, most insurance-approved, most employer-sponsored form of mental health treatment in existence, because it does work, and not for you, of course, but for the system that benefits from your compliance. Now we're up to section 3, how therapy language creates power dynamics. Let's recall our phrase book now. We collected terms like cognitive distortions, intellectualizing, catastrophizing, black and white thinking, and can you recall the pattern? There is nothing that you can voice in terms of your thoughts, feelings, or theories that can't be dismissed or deemed incorrect or deemed pathological. The therapist has the full power to decree what is correct or even real. Challenge your therapist's interpretation, it gets labelled as resistance or non-compliance, which is an actual term in therapeutic and medical circles. It's also taken as proof of your pathology. Our phrasebook outlines what is actually a closed system. There is no exit door. And just so it's clear that CBT is not the only guilty party here, here's an example from psychoanalysis. But Doc, my dog is not a replacement child. I never wanted kids. I mean, having a kid would be a sort of a shit replacement dog. Child stuff isn't my issue here. Then your doc replies, "But, my dear, it's in your nature. You've repressed the desire so you don't see it, but it's clear to me that your failure to live out a woman's destiny is the source of your depression." The moment a therapist has decided what is wrong with you, or even the moment you show up, they've claimed authority over your reality. Your lived experience gets subordinated to their clinical categories. Now, much of this closed system stuff falls into what philosophers classify as unfalsifiable theories, because there is no possible evidence that could prove your therapist wrong if they aren't open to being proven wrong. The therapist can claim authority over your inner state, using words like subconscious, repression, saying that you can't rely on your nervous system and so on, just to suggest that you yourself can't see what they can. The assumption is literally that they know more about your reality than you do. Now, Foucault saw this coming. He showed that psychiatric authority doesn't require proof. It requires the patient to accept that the expert has access to truths about them that they themselves cannot verify. That the moment you accept that premise, you've surrendered your reality to someone else's interpretation. Interestingly, Norcross and Anderson in 2010 show that this buying into the therapist's authority is a key factor in therapy having what is termed successful outcomes, as measured by various metrics, including the ability to work, i.e. to fit into the system. As we just saw, these self-perpetuating power imbalances don't just operate in CBT. They can be found in psychoanalysis and even modern applications like family constellation work, where the facilitator decides what the overriding narrative is. And, from my experience, dealing with archetypes and narratives, usually something deeply heteronormative. The gaslighting mechanism we saw earlier can also operate in positive psychology and coaching's frameworks, which focus on mindset, with little reference to structural problems or talking through issues. Now, other applications do exist, my favourite of which is Rogers talk therapy because it dispenses with hierarchy. But these are not funded by governments and are thus only available to those with financial resources, which is the perfect lead-in to this next specific theme: power's recruitment process. This operates on 2 levels. I started to notice it when listening to therapy podcasts, and even one of my favourites that did Jungian dream interpretation. But listening to these, I began to notice that the therapists themselves seem to kind of lack insight into certain kinds of life experience, like severe childhood trauma or addictions, or the mental effects of decades of grinding poverty, or relocation and or marginalisation. They professed to know about these, of course, and they tried, but how they dealt with what came in from listeners was sometimes deeply distressing. Because there is not just a class dimension to who gets to see certain kinds of therapists. Jungian therapists, for example, they cost upwards of $200 an hour. There is also a class dimension to who gets to become a therapist. Now, as some of you listeners know, I'm doing a 2nd degree in psychology, so my professor is who opened my eyes to this. and a conversation that began with her explaining that I could never become a therapist in Germany. And new regulations had come in only a couple of years ago, and anyone who studied their BSc as distance learning was no longer allowed to enrol in the master's program required to become a therapist. But that's not the most interesting thing. She also explained that most therapists went straight from school, so teenagers going straight from school into university attendance, often still staying at home. Then they went straight from there to their masters, then into a field of application they needed to study. Now that requires a lot of money. So most people can only do that if they have affluent parents who are prepared to support them through it. Studying in later life? Well, most of us can only do that via distance learning. And this is how Germany goes about ensuring mainly the young, inexperienced and rich become therapists. But Germany is not alone in ensuring that it's mostly a certain group of people who get to become the voices of the social order. The US, for example, does this via unpaid internships, expensive supervision hours, years of graduate school with no income, which again requires financial resources that they will only have if they've got a certain kind of background. So different structural barriers and mechanisms with the same result. A profession that filters for class privilege. And importantly, those who don't necessarily have much experience of life's adversities, calamities and limits. And the people who most likely do know what you might be going through, well, they've lived a little. They've hit brick walls or been hit by brick walls or by Joe Shithead himself. But instead of being heard by those kinds of people, you are most likely to have someone who's only read about your experiences in a sort of a how the other half live theoretical way. And it is usually they who get to tell you what to do and who you are without actually having been there themselves. So this is why you so often end up with someone who's never experienced structural exploitation telling you that your anger at said exploitation is a cognitive distortion, or someone who's never struggled financially pathologizing your anxiety about poverty, or someone who's never faced systemic injustice dismissing your rage as unresolved childhood issues, and or telling you to change your mindset, or someone who has never struggled with the inner pain that leads to addictions and depression. The scary part is, those who do fit in are the ones that get to pathologize those who don't. At their disposal, unfalsifiable concepts like repression to claim authority over experiences they've never had. They see fit to label others dysfunctional because they're comfortable imagining that others know too little of their own minds and that they know how things should go. In other words, the classism can move into arrogance without the practitioner even being aware of it. Now, I want to illustrate this from one of my own experiences living in Germany with a German therapist. Now, this is not just a class bias, it's also a cultural bias. So, as background, some of you may know this. In Germany, you kind of are what you do for a job. Work is really their be-all and end-all. In any case, this is a very long time ago, and I was in a very deleterious relationship without actually knowing that it was one. It mimicked my family home, which I also didn't know at the time. I was also a musician, juggling part-time jobs to get by. So when I arrive in the office of Dr. Schittenhelm, he didn't listen very long. He drifted off entirely when I started talking about my actual current feelings. I was deeply depressed. And his verdict, after all of 10 minutes, was as follows. If you got a stable, normal job, you'd feel much better. Now, I felt outraged and unseen and totally abandoned. And even so, what I did next was not great. I replied with, "You're not. You mean like freedom through work? Because seriously, I'm pretty sure that phrase has not suddenly stopped being really fucking monstrous." He threw me out of his office at that point. This story, like everything from Germany, is an incredibly efficient example, showing how therapy functions to pull you back in line. In Germany, a highly conservative, emotionally desolate and non-curious society, the answer to everything is work. Your inner world is irrelevant. Your functionality within the system is of primary importance. Therapy here was very clearly trying to get me back in line. It also shows this. When only the socially compliant get to define what healthy looks like, pathology becomes whatever threatens their worldview, And this still isn't about bad therapists, it's about a system that structurally positions practitioners above the lived reality of those they're meant to serve. So, therapy has become a class-filtered compliance mechanism that serves capitalist normalisation, not healing. But there's another layer to this, one that reveals an even darker parallel. In part 2, we'll examine how the system operates through scapegoating, the mechanism narcissistic systems use to maintain control. We'll look at how shame keeps scapegoats in place, how the DSM sanctifies that scapegoating by pathologising normal responses to abnormal conditions, and why we base mental illness on cultural ideals rather than actual norms. Most importantly, part 2 offers solutions. How to recognise when the problem is not you, how to trust yourself again, and 3 questions you can ask yourself to know you're fundamentally okay as a human being. No institutional fixing required. And if you can't wait for that, episode 8 offers a deeper dive into how society operates like a covert narcissistic parent, using Foucault, Bourdieu, Althusser and Butler to map the mechanism. It's linked below. Until next time, thanks for listening. Bye.